There we go. Right, so a very, very good evening to you all. My name's Carolyn Bryce. I'm a bereaved parent. I lost my daughter Rosie suddenly in 2004. I'm also Chief Executive of Compassionate Friends in the UK, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all to the fourth of our special online talk hosted by the Compassionate Friends, where inspiring speakers share their own unique personal perspectives and reflections on parental and sibling grief. It is fitting, I guess, that we are here meeting together today on Remembrance Day, as we are all here because of and in remembrance of the son or daughter, brother or sister or grandchild we have lost. We're really truly delighted to welcome the author and blogger Andrea Corrie as our guest speaker this evening. But before we start, I just have a few housekeeping notes and information for you. So those of you who've been to one of these talks before, you will have heard me say this, but just to remind everyone that you've all been muted, as we have, I think, how many? Nearly 150 people joining us today. Please, can we ask you to keep your mute function on, and then please use the chat function, which I see that many of you have found at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat function to offer any feedback, comments, and particularly questions for Andrea during her talk or at the end. And we plan to finish about 8:15 or so. We are all, of course, acutely aware what a hugely challenging time it is for the economy as a whole, and the charity sector is no exception. So I just wanted to offer our warm appreciation and thank you for any donation you've been able to make to the Compassionate Friends when registering for this talk. Your support means a great deal to the volunteers and small but hugely dedicated staff team at the Compassionate Friends. And it's so critical in helping us to offer our unique lifeline of peer support and understanding to the many bereaved parents and their families who look for us for help and hope. Look to us. So here's a bit more last sales pitch. Please remember you can donate at any time to us by going to the donate button on our website, or even better, join us as a donating member. Just find Join TCF on our website. Also, if you know of any organisations, companies, individuals with whom we work, have close contacts with, or are client of, now is the time to exploit those contacts to raise funds or donations for our charity. So this is the fourth in our series of talks, and each one has been very much designed to offer you an insight into one person's perspectives and reflections on their grief journey. They are not meant to tell you what you should or shouldn't do to navigate and cope with your devastating loss. Each one of us, or each one of you, is completely different and will find ways through which are personal and individual to you. If you are at the beginning of your loss, in the first few months or years, you'll probably not believe me, and I didn't when another bereaved parent told me this a few months after the death of my daughter. But I want you to know that although this loss can never be fixed, it does get easier to bear. We do somehow learn to cope and live around and with our grief. The rawness of early grief does eventually dissipate, and we are nourished somehow by our love for and memories of the life of our child or sibling. And we're able to live life again. Maybe not the life we wanted, but some kind of purposeful, even happy life again. I'm and many of my colleagues, volunteers and friends in TCF are proof of that. Even though I know at the beginning, I thought I would never ever be happy or feel any kind of joy ever again. In the years after the loss of my daughter, I found it really helpful to listen in the TCF support group I attended to the ways that other parents a bit further on than me had been able to cope and manage and survive. I also avidly read our bereavement support magazine, Compassion, for articles that I could relate to and spoke about how I felt. So this series of talks by bereaved parents we have set up stems from wanting to offer you all more opportunity to hear from others who have walked a similar road of loss to you. in the hope that as you have listened to past speakers and will listen to our speaker, Andrea, tonight, you'll hear one or two things that resonate and will be of help to you as you carry on somehow physically without your much loved son or daughter or brother or sister. Of course, our loved ones are always with us, always in our heart. But I hope you will perhaps find something in Andrea's words that will help you live with the tragedy of your loved one who has died far too soon. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce, finally, Andrea Corrie to you all. I've never met Andrea in person, only by Zoom, but I feel I've met her in many ways through her words in her inspiring and uplifting books. These books are how Andrea really first came to my attention. Andrea is not only an author, but she also writes a regular blog entitled Multi-Layered Musings from New Normality, which has charted her thoughts about love and loss, hope and resilience, and much more besides. Following the loss of her 19-year-old son, James, to a drowning accident in the river at Kingston upon Thames in 2005, Andrea says she found some measure of solace in writing articles for bereavement websites, in particular the Compassionate Friends, but also the US-based Drowning Support Network. The feedback she received from others in similar circumstances who found her writing helpful encouraged her. She realized the power of writing as a tool for processing grief, and then published her 2 books, Into the Morning Light in 2014, and now this year, Living in the Morning Light. Of her writing, Andrea says, "My books aim to uplift, inform, and inspire readers with a sense of hope for the future, as well as providing a lasting legacy for my son." She has provided another type of legacy for James too, as Andrea is a water safety advocate for the RNLI and the Fire and Rescue Services, committed to raising awareness of the importance of reducing the incidence of drowning. She also gives presentations to various organisations, sharing her insights into the grief process, and in particular referring to the numerous pathways we find ourselves following as bereaved parents on the journey none of us ever wish to take. We're absolutely delighted that Andrea has agreed to talk to us this evening. And my hope is that you find a little something, as I said, or perhaps a bit more, to take away to sustain you from our evening with her tonight. Thank you for coming to speak to us, Andrea, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that fantastic welcome by you and on behalf of TCF. And thank you to TCF for inviting me to share some of my thoughts this evening. And it's interesting that Caroline mentioned again something that we said when we had a Zoom conversation a few weeks ago when I was talking about the contents of my talk this evening. And she said, you know, God, a lot of people won't believe you. They're not going to believe your words when you say that you can find the light again after your tragic loss, because a lot of people will be very newly on the path of grief and loss. And I've thought about that quite a lot since we had that conversation. And I think it's fair comment. I don't very often go back to that very early dark time because I'm in real terms a long way along the line. I'm 15 years since we lost James, but that doesn't detract from that feeling of always being there. And I've mentioned before this expression of having that James-shaped hole, that person-shaped hole where your dear loved one should be. The hardest part of any of these talks or presentations is actually getting past the beginning bit, really, because that's where I have to relate what actually happened. And every time I relate it, that never gets any easier. So without further ado, and providing my tech abilities are working okay this evening, I'll introduce you to my lovely son, James. This was James in Brighton. He was 19 and he was home with us from the summer after completing his first year of a primary school teaching degree down at Brighton University, and we were living in Surrey at the time. And he was very happy lad. He was happy-go-lucky, and he was enjoying being home for the summer. On that particular night, he was meeting up with some of his college friends. He'd been at college in Egham, and he was meeting up and catching up with his friends. And before he went out, he said to me, "Don't worry, Mum, if I'm not home tonight, you know, I might stay over at a friend's." And that wasn't an unusual thing for him to do. And generally, like most teenagers, it would be an empty tummy the next day that would send them home, to stoke up again before he went back out. So I wasn't actually all that concerned when I got home from work the next day and he wasn't home. But my anxiety started to grow. And I think you have to remember as well, in 2005, the social media and our mobile phone communications and technologies weren't as advanced as they are now. So it was, it was harder to keep in contact with people than it is now. And one of his friends rang in the evening who'd been out with him the night before and said, "Do you know where James is? Because none of us has been able to get hold of him today." And when she said that they'd been in Kingston, they'd spent the evening in drinking in Kingston, and they'd finished their evening at a nightclub by the riverside, my heart sank, and something me knew that something dreadful had happened to James. And it was an entirely, there's no blame to attach to anybody. It was entirely a tragic accident that at the end of the evening, both the groups of friends divided into two to get taxis home, and neither realised that James wasn't with them. And he wasn't that familiar with the area, and he'd had a few drinks, he put a few drinks on board, and he simply lost his balance and fell in the river. And he was recovered 3 days later. And that particular time is something that, nobody's going to want to dwell on that, and I won't dwell on that here, because anybody who's lost somebody, you will all know what that feels like. Those very, very early days and moments are incredibly hard. But what do you do? What do you do when this terrible things happen, and when the worst thing that can befall a parent has happened and you've lost a dearly loved child? My initial response was to lose myself in practicalities, and I think that's not an unusual one, actually, for people to want to get involved. You're always looking for distractions. I still look for distractions now that take you away from having to focus too hard on the grief and what's happened. And we had a very successful campaign with Kingston Council to improve safety measures at the riverside, because when James had his accident, they were practically non-existent. And we were very fortunate that there was a good response from the council. And 3 years later, the area was very, very different. It is as it is today, much lighter and brighter and safer for everybody. And there was this need in me to try to make sure that I made a difference and that this didn't happen to anybody in the future. And because of what happened at Kingston and events that happened later on with my writing, I became indirectly through that, became involved with the RNLI and fire and rescue organisations that I'll talk about a little bit later on. So that's the practical side. That was the practical bit of the brain that was working actually more efficiently than I could have believed, really, in those first 3 years. But who can help? There's your own innate resources and your own innate resilience, but you need support and you need help to get through these dreadful times. I was signposted to TCF, actually. I've put them top. They really are top, because they were an absolute lifeline for me right from the very beginning. And I was signposted to them through a condolence card, actually. I hadn't heard of them, and it's something I still bang the drum about, that there isn't sufficient awareness of TCF really in various areas, but that's a whole other story. And I was signposted to TCF, and I found that initial thing, I was desperate to find other mums who'd lost teen children. I didn't feel I had as much in common with someone who'd lost a very young child. But I needed reassurance from people who were further along the line than me that this would get better. And my initial mentor, I don't think they called them mentors at the time, but the initial TCF helpline contact that I had was a gentleman who was about 9 years post-loss at the time. And he said to me, "It will get better, you will feel better, you won't always feel this dreadful." And like Carolyn says, I'm not sure I absolutely believed him, but it was a start. That was one of the first glimmers of light, was to speak to people who really got it. And there's no substitute, and there's still no substitute for that. as far as I'm concerned. I've made the most amazing friendships with GCF, enduring friendships. I don't want to mention too many names. I will mention one name, my dear friend Linda, who we walk a very similar path together, and we've become very close. And if it wasn't for TCF, I wouldn't have known her. And TCF signposted me also. Someone in TCF told me about Drowning Support Network in America, obviously water related, run by a lady called Nancy Rigg, who lost her fiance to a swift water drowning accident many years ago. A very proactive lady. And through that forum, I met online our dear friend Karen in Australia, and she'd lost her son in a drowning accident at sea in Australia. And she and I really connected and got on well. And we communicated for something like 8 years, I think, by email before she and her husband did a grand European trip and came over to England, and we met up and they stayed with us for a week. And it's we sort of laugh ironically about it, as it's been a hell of a way to make them friends. But we still have a regular correspondence, and we've chatted on Skype and things since lockdown and so on. And there's no filter. You know, if you are talking to a fellow bereaved parent who's had a similar loss to you, and never the same because we are individuals, but there's no filter, and you can say, you know, some of the conversations, if they were heard by people who were kind of outside that, wouldn't get it at all. You develop quite a dark sense of humour, I think, which is another tool for getting through it. Counselling, Cruise bereavement care and counselling I've mentioned here is not for everybody. And I really didn't think it was me. I think for me, I think in the early years, I was very much like, I'm coping okay, what do I need counselling for? But I did opt on the advice of my GP, I think probably about 18 months after I'd lost James, to go for have some counselling, and actually found it very helpful. And again, this is something that's changed over the years, because there are a lot of talking therapies and CBT online things that you can access without needing a referral from your GP. And I do think that it can be helpful, but I would advise against doing it too soon after loss, because one of the things that counselling does is pull up what is there, what you may be tamping down, and there may be a good reason early on for tamping down, because you just can't cope with bringing things to the fore too soon. But it definitely does have its place, and I think if you've got a good GP, which I was very fortunate to have a good GP, and you foster that relationship with your GP, and they can perhaps flag if you're dipping a bit, then that is a very good thing. And there's no shame in admitting you need some help. I've had some issues myself with anxiety in the last few years, and I've accessed some online help for that. Found it very useful, and again, it's another thing in the toolbox to think about. You might be surprised that I've put family and friends bottom on this slide, but there is a good reason for that, and it's really basically that your family and your friends are grieving too, and they're not grieving in the same way as you are for the lost person, the child or sibling, but they are dealing with grief, so they're not necessarily best placed to help you. You might be supporting each other, but there's a I don't want to get into a whole melting pot with this one, but there's a huge difference between the way men and women grieve, and I think that that's something that TCF has picked up on, particularly in more recent years. And it's sometimes you just need them to be there without actually constantly raking over what's happened and making yourself feel worse. We were only married 6 weeks. My husband Sean and I were only married 6 weeks when James died. So we were up here, and then we were right down there in a very short space of time. And I felt terrible for him that he'd lost the wife he married almost as soon as he married her, because I couldn't be quite that same woman again. And it's all credit to him that he's remained my rock, and my daughter as well. She's older than James, and in the early years, it was very difficult. We're close, but it was very difficult for us to talk about what had happened and what had happened to James. And that insight, her insight, has changed massively since she became a mum herself. And there's a lot of joy between us now when we recognise little glimpses of James in my grandson. And so this is one of the huge joys that I'm very, very fortunate to have going forward. And some friends, your friendships will change. You'll make lots of new friends. Initially, probably more bereaved parents than not bereaved people and not bereaved people. But some of your old friendships, some friends find that they just can't cope with your loss, and you have to cut them a bit of slack, which is very, very hard to do in the beginning. I think I used to have a parallel monologue or dialogue going on in my mind sometimes in the early days, where I felt the friends weren't being what I wanted them to be or what they should be. And there's no answer to that. There isn't anything they should or shouldn't be. But I think people learn when they're around you and how you give out that you're dealing with what's happened to you, they respond to. And the more positive you can be with that, not trying to pretend that everything's okay, because that doesn't really help either, but just being very honest and open with people. And if you're having a bad day and you don't want to talk, then you can say so. Equally, and what's the worst thing that can happen? People shy away from asking you about your lost loved one. What's the worst thing that can happen? Actually, is that you might burst into tears. And I think you really. I'm a great believer in talking about grief and getting things out in the open and being able to share them. So that's just really talking is one of the biggest tools. And I'll go on now and share some other. I often talk about the grief toolbox, and guess what's top of mind? It was never going to be anything other than words. Reading, writing, generally talking, as my husband will attest, I'm very good at talking. But that is important. Reading is fantastic. Yeah, I think early on, when maybe you don't want to talk and you can't articulate grief, reading about other people's journeys through grief and looking for the positive sides of that process is very helpful. I found very helpful over the years, and I still do read quite a bit, though not as much as I did initially. I kept a journal in the first year. Well, I've always kept journals and diaries and things. The one I kept in the first year, I think, hit the bin eventually because it was just too dark there. But it helped me to get those words out there. And you may say, well, I'm not a writer, I couldn't do that. But if you just sit and write about what you can see out of the window, you're getting something out there. And if you get into a regular habit of keeping a diary or a journal, you can look back after a period of time. You can look back and you will see progress. You will definitely see progress, I think, if you stick with it. So I'm not so good at doing it every day now, but I suppose every week, and I use my blog quite a lot to express what I'm feeling. As I say, I'm a great believer in expressing things and actually getting them out there, rather than having this pressure cooker effect of keeping things locked in and then eventually it comes out. It doesn't come out in a controlled way. It comes out in a book, which you can do in writing or drawing or other creativity. And boosting endorphins. I mean, that sounds really obvious, doesn't it? I think I don't want to dwell on what the COVID pandemic has done to all of us, but I think during that time in lockdown when we couldn't drive anywhere and everybody started walking more, I think we all gained a bit of an appreciation. Those of us who are well enough and able enough to get outside, I think we all gained an appreciation of actually how mood lifting and mood enhancing exercise is. At that first lockdown, the weather was fabulous most of the time. And we discovered a lot of new walks, all hilly. We moved to Devon and it's very hilly. But we really enjoyed it. And I think that even if you're in a built up area and you just get out in the fresh air and you can see something of nature, then that is uplifting in itself. and cooking and creative artwork and things like that. Anything that endorphin boosting, I think for me, it will be something that focuses my mind and actually takes it off the treadmill of grieving. Again, not so frequently now that I'm where I am now, but certainly in the early days, I needed things that I could focus one part of my mind on. And I got very good at that numbers thing, Sudoku. I never say it right, Sudoku. And I got really good at it, and I realised it was because it was holding all my attention for that time. And I've tried to do it again recently. I can't do it, and I don't know why. But in the first months after James died, I was quite obsessed with it, and I'm sure that at the time it was my mind wanting to wing off and do something different. And now my preference would be other forms of creativity that aren't quite so taxing to one bit of the mind. And return to colour. I don't think I've shared this story before. Starting with your wardrobe, probably a couple of years after James died, I was at work one day, and it's a bit difficult to describe the setup of the building, but I was in a corridor and I was waiting for somebody to come out of the room, and a couple of colleagues who I didn't know particularly well went past, and they sort of stopped. I think they were making coffee or something like that, and they didn't know that I was still in earshot because just of the layout of the building. They didn't know I was still in earshot, and I heard one say to the other, "Who's that we just passed in the corridor?" And the other woman said, "Oh, that was Andrea. She's one of the medical secretaries. So, she had a terrible tragedy a couple of years ago." And I was standing there sort of with bated breath, and all credit to this lady. She didn't go into what the tragedy was. She left it there, but she said, and now she always dresses as though she's going to a funeral. So it can't be very helpful, can it? Oh dear. I thought, I looked down and I had a black jacket and a grey top and a black skirt and tights and shoes and things. I mean, workwear is by its nature fairly sober. But it was so dull. And I went home and I looked in my wardrobe, and there were greys and navies and blacks and browns. And I realised that without actually realising it myself, I had got very, very dull. And I'm not saying that I started going out and buying bubblegum pink mini dresses or anything like that, but I began to pick up pretty scarves and tops. So I've intentionally worn something colourful this evening, and actually it makes you feel better. And there's a lot of anybody who's delved into any kind of colour therapy, or what your colours should be for your complexion and things like that, will know that actually it really does have a very subliminal but very distinct effect. And so that's something that I've stuck with over the years, and I make a very conscious effort. It's all part of putting on that mask, I think, of being able to face the day. And now, hopefully, I don't permanently look as though I'm on my way to a funeral, which is a good thing. Which is hope, resilience, new connections. They don't happen overnight. Hope's always there, the hope that it's going to get better and the faith that it's going to get better. And those two things combined, to my mind, equal a resilience. And we are resilient creatures by nature. That is part of the human condition that we I don't like that cliche that says, we're strong enough to cope with everything that's thrown at us. But actually, I suppose it is quite true. We are often a lot stronger than we give ourselves credit for. And the new connections I mentioned a little bit earlier, the first sort of friendships I made after we lost James were through TCF and Drowner Support Network, and then gradually it's broadened out. And we've moved house twice since James died, and that's a hard thing to do because you have the fear that you're going to leave that person behind. And I can assure you that you don't. They're with you. They're in us, aren't they? That whoever it is we've lost is in our heart and walks in our shadow with us and are always in our minds. So I had that anxiety, certainly the first time we moved, but I realised that James is wherever I am anyway, so I really don't have that worry anymore. And I've made new friends, particularly since moving to Devon, who never knew James, and it's wonderful that I can talk about him, and I tell all about him and not dwelling so much on what happened, but what kind of person he was. And I love it when people say, "Oh, I can really get the picture of what character James was," because he was full of life. He was a very bubbly kind of boy and a young man, and he was very likable. He was a great friend to many people. And it's sad. There's that poignancy that that all these new people couldn't meet James, but there are so many more people who know about James in these last 15 years than I could ever have imagined. And some of the new connections that I've made through the RNLI and fire and rescue organisations, there's been a crossover from them being colleagues to actual friends and becoming family friends, which is something I think quite wonderful. So that really deals with the sort of practical and emotional side of loss and grief. And what about the creative side, which of course I've mentioned, but I will just spend a little time, if I may, talking about my books. I'm just going to take a sip of water, if you don't mind. Excuse me. Never believe anybody who tells you it doesn't take long to write a book. Into the Morning Light, my first book was published in 2014, which was 8 years after we lost James, and really relates very much the story of those first 8 years of loss, and covers really quite a lot of ground there. It's not all my voice. I think if both my books were entirely my voice, that they wouldn't have the breadth of appeal that they do. There are contributions from TCF members and other bereaved people in both books, and they're part of that legacy and part of that thing where you're laying down. If you read Into the Morning Light, they don't have to. They're independent. Living in the Morning Light isn't necessarily a sequel to Into the Morning Light, but if you read Into the Morning Light, it does take you along a progression. I don't want to say word journey because it's so overworked, but it takes you along a progression from the very beginning of loss through those first 8 years. And through Into the Morning Light, the RNLI, one of the RNLI people at Teddington, which isn't very far from Kingston, where James's accident happened, picked up on some publicity around the book and asked me if I wanted to become involved with the Respect Water campaign that year in 2014. And my connection and association with the RNLI has continued since then. It's something I'm incredibly proud of. And I think James would be incredibly proud of as well, that I've been able to do this. And for every time that I tell his story, then every time I'm hoping more lives are saved and there's less likelihood of accidental drownings going forward. And Living in the Morning Light came about really because, well, that's how I feel I am. That's where I feel I am now, and where people can get to. And it focuses very much on the more positive aspects of life coming further along in your loss and grief. And I'm focusing on joy, the attributes of joy, and the keys to living a happier life, and the keys to, I don't like to use the word acceptance, because I don't think you can ever truly accept the loss of a child. It's outside the natural order of things to lose your child. But assimilation, how you assimilate that loss into your life, and it doesn't define you in the same way as it did right at the beginning. As time passes, it becomes a softer thing. That roller coaster, that initial very early, the peaks and troughs, they level out. And I'm very, very fond of the cover of Living in the Morning Light, because this is actually the background. I don't know whether you can see that on your screens, Caroline, but the background, the trees in the mist were on my way to work one morning when I was driving out of Bampton in Devon, where I live. And I took a couple of shots because I thought the light, it just absolutely typified what the morning light is to me. You've got the sunlight and the beautiful clear sky and the mist and the clouds all dissipating in the sunlight. And the butterflies, there are 3 butterflies on the cover And that was a painted lady butterfly that was photographed by a friend of ours who was down here visiting and allowed me to use that on the cover. And to me, that just sort of sums it up really quite well. So moving on from that creative side, so I think we've looked at the practical side and the emotional side and the creative side of grief and how it moves along, it progresses, it doesn't change, it's never static. It becomes something that you can accommodate, and it ceases to define you in that really harsh way that it did at the beginning. And any tools that you can grab onto, anything that really works for you, whether it's a faith thing or really anything, whether it's an actual active thing or a passive thing, just hold it, keep it, put it in your toolbox, and use it to the best of your ability. I'm going to touch on secondary loss because this is something that I really only learned about relatively recently, or recognised, I should say, relatively recently. It is the absence of the presence of your loved one. It's also the presence of the absence of your loved one. Family events, you begin to learn fairly quickly, I think, when you've lost somebody, how to cope through, mark them off, birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, holidays, all those things. You learn to cope. And Remembrance Day being today, as Carolyn mentioned, every day is Remembrance Day to a grieving person, because every day is significant to a grieving person. 24/7, isn't it? It's not to a particular time. But when you're maybe a bit further along the line, as we were, and we started having family weddings and babies coming along and things like that, that's when you really have to garner up all your resilience to get through them, because you are missing that person so much that they should be there. And it's a horrible feeling. It's a different feeling to that real early rawness and that real darkness. There is this sort of a light around it, but it's very, very hard. It's like when I see my grandchildren, I know what a fantastic Uncle James would be, because he was ever so silly, and he would have been lovely with the kids. He would have absolutely loved them. My stepson, I've seen him with children. My extended family, they would have all melded together so well, and being very much part of the family. And it's very hard to accept that they're not there. That empty chair is that horrible empty chair thing. And how you deal with it. I think I've learned over the years. There's one little thing that I do at Christmas time, and it's a silent thing. James had he loved Christmas, and he had quite a big bag of wrapping stuff. There was paper and little bits of ribbon and tinsely things, and he loved a bit of sparkle. And every Christmas, I just will quietly use a little bit of stuff. And there's still some left, even after 50 years. And silly things like this, I'll just show you here. Little tiny battery operated tea light. Can you see it? It's quite a little cheapy, nasty battery operated tea light that I came across recently of his, and it still works. So I thought that was lovely to have that behind me this evening as a little thing of James being here and softening a little bit that secondary loss, of knowing that he is always here, regardless of what the event, whether it's trivial things that you're going through or more important and significant things. And trying to look forward. I learned fairly early on to delete the what ifs from my mind. That is dreadful when you're very early in grief and you go through these scenarios in your head, don't you? What if he hadn't gone out that night? What if I'd said, please do you stay in? What if? And we can't rewrite the page. however hard we try, we cannot rewrite the page and we cannot get them back. And that is really, really hard. But if you look forward and you embrace all these things that you're pulling in around you that give you the optimism to live a joyful life, and embrace that hope and hold it in your heart and live your life the best you can for those who can't be here to live it with you. You're almost having to live extra for the people that you've lost. I always feel that I owe it to James to live more because he isn't here. And I don't want to put that on anybody else in the family. That's my more, because I think it's something that was the speaker last time said about when she lost her brother, she felt she had to be more. And I think it's not something I've specifically discussed with my daughter, but it's my more. It's not her more. It's not anybody else's more. And I think it's a good thing to hold on to I try not to waste my days. I feel like it's important. I haven't got that many left, I suppose. As you get older, of course, it's something that you feel more, isn't it? That the time races past and you just want to embrace that joy when you can. And a really good final example of what it's like to live in the morning light came about from my lovely friend Linda. She'll remember this one. One day she said to me, "Have you ever heard of a monkey's wedding?" Pardon, what on earth is a monkey's wedding? And a monkey's wedding describes is a weather thing, actually. It's also known as a rain shower, a sun shower. And we couldn't quite get to the origins of the saying. It was possibly arguable it came from South Africa originally. But it describes the sun being out at the same time as it's raining. So it's the sunshine tempered by the showers. And I think it's a very good analogy for grief. We can get ourselves back into the light again in time. As I said, no quick fix, but we can get ourselves back into the light. But it's always tempered by that sadness of what isn't there. But they coexist and they begin to balance. And whereas in the very early days, you feel quite unbalanced, unhinged even by your grief, you do level up again and you do become a person who can walk straight down the road again. Whether the sun's out or it's raining, you just somehow manage to do it. We never get over it, but we won't learn to live with it. And I'd like to just leave you with James and say, that it is always possible to come out of the darkness back into the light. And I hope that you will all be able to, if you're very early on, find that too, and just know that there is life after loss and we can all live in the morning light. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you for that very honest and moving, actually, walk through your journey. So we come to the part of the evening where you any feedback you want to give Andrea, if you'd like to ask her any questions, make any comments. We have had one question, just that I'll ask you now, Andrea, about your books being in an audio format, because as we know, it's you know, for many, I found this as well. Early on, after my loss, I just couldn't actually read anything very much, or I could only really read bereavement books, and I didn't have much concentration span. So you know, your books are so helpful and so supportive, as someone else has mentioned in the chat, and Vicky, I think. Are the books available on audio, or do you have any plans to?
They're not, Carolyn. To be quite honest, I'm not sure how to go about that. It's something I've thought about, but I don't know. I don't know how it's achieved. And if anybody does know that a good, relatively budget-friendly way to do it, then I would certainly look into it. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to? Would you mind just taking down the slide, or and then we can all see each other? Maybe would that be okay?
How do I do that? Just
That's it, like that, and then
that.
stop share. Stop share.
Stop share. Right.
That's it.
Hello, everyone.
There we go. Does anyone have any comments or questions that they would like to ask Andrea? Some lovely comments. Thank you for sharing. I'm in the very early stages of grief. This is from Charmaine. Nearly 6 months since I lost my 18-year-old. I get great comfort hearing other people's survival mechanisms. Yeah, I can relate to that. Jude asks, how do you deal with people who just really think that after nearly 4 years at Christmas time for me, I should be getting over it?
Oh gosh.
Words and wisdom, Andrea.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, actually, I can remember an instance of that was quite similar around Christmas. It was one of my bosses, one of my old bosses where I used to work, who had children himself, and he came into the office one day near Christmas, and it was fairly close to Christmas, and he said, "Oh, so you looking forward to Christmas?" I think it was about the third one after we'd lost James, and I said, "No, not especially." He'd got me at a bad moment, and he said, "Oh, why not?" So I said, "Well, if you remember, I lost my son not very long ago." "Oh, yes," he said, "I expect you must still miss him." Walked out of the room. And I was so stunned, and I just didn't know what to say. And I was very upset. And actually, a colleague went and said to him on my behalf afterwards, after we'd had a conversation about it. Not, she was tempted to say to him, "Can you imagine how you'd feel if it was your child?" She didn't say that, which was your knee-jerk reaction, which she said, just remember that when you lose a child, you are still a parent to that child, and she will never get over that loss. She has to learn to live with it, and it's a hard one. I just think that whoever should just respond and say that, I'm still grieving. My grief, you can't turn grief on and off like a tap. It's with you all the time. I don't know if that really answers it, was helpful.
Thank you. Liz asks, am I alone in feeling my beloved child is still around and sending me signs?
No, not at all.
You relate to that?
Butterflies have always been signs of James to us. We had, certainly in the early years, we had an awful lot of incidences of where they turned up in very unusual places. And in fact, as recently as last year, when my daughter changed her car, she picked up she got a second-hand car from the dealer, and she drove home, and she opened the glove box to get something out, and a butterfly flew out. And it was just so strange. So I think, you take whatever helps you. If you interpret it as signs, then take them as signs. I think that's perfectly normal.
Thank you. And Tina asks, when you meet people and they ask you how many children you have, how do you respond, Andrea?
Oh gosh, I was going to talk about that, and then I thought it's such a thorny one that I was concerned about that very question. Initially, early on, I think I probably would have told anybody and everybody what had happened. You learn to be a little bit more circumspect, because you begin to realize the impact when you answer that question honestly in a social situation, say maybe a party or something like that, that it just stops the conversation in its tracks. And some people may think that is a cop-out, but I would sometimes respond by turning it round to the other person and saying, oh, we've got a blended family and they're all around the country. How about you? And it avoids the need to say, it's not denying then that James existed. It's not, it's a bit, as I say, I think it's a bit of a cop-out, but it's one that I can be quite comfortable with. And I've learned, you know, it's hard when you like starting a new workplace and things like that, because people it's always just an automatic question. And I think I've become more selective about how much detail I want to go into. So I think if you prepare yourself, because you're always slightly on the back foot, aren't you? Whenever you go into a new social situation, you know that it's a natural thing that's going to come up. And if you've got prepared in your mind, oh, I think tonight I'm just going to say, well, we're a blended family and we're all over the place. How about you? There's nothing wrong with that, because guilt is another massive thing that I often write and speak about. Guilt goes with the territory. I think with loss as well, you feel guilty that you couldn't have prevented it or stopped it or made it different.
And that can change, can't it, Andrea? How you feel, what you say about, as you said, what how many children you've got can change from situation to situation, who you're meeting,
I know. I
how you're feeling.
Yes, I wouldn't. Don't actually directly. I wouldn't actually ever say I've got one child, because I haven't. I've got two, and I'll always have two. So, but I might, you know, work around a little bit rather than actually be too specific. Because as I say, you don't want to share it with everybody. It's too private and it's too personal. But what's interesting actually is that when you do, if you do sort of get to know new people, and then gradually things start to come out as you get to know them a bit better, everybody's got a story. And that was another weird thing in the first few years. I think when we went on holidays, holidays are a funny thing in early grief, because it's almost like a relief from grieving sometimes to be in a strange place with strange people. But we met so many other bereaved parents. It was really odd in the first 5 years or so. Every time we went away, we'd land up having a conversation with someone who'd suddenly say, "Oh, I lost a child," and you'd think, "Oh, how weird that we were drawn together." But maybe it isn't weird.
There's a question here from Rivka about your writing, actually. Did you start writing soon after the loss of James?
Yes.
Then did it take time to compile the first book?
Yes, I started writing. Well, I started writing for myself initially. Say my first year's journal, I didn't share with anybody, and then I started writing for TCF actually, and Drowning Support Network, and I did a bit for Cruise, and gradually amassed articles, not my own, by other people, and it's quite a process. It's quite. I kind of reached a point after about 6 years, I think, where I looked at this great stack of paper and thought, well, I really need to do something with this or not. So I had to get kind of organized then into turning it into a book.
Thank you. There's another question about family, actually. Sally asks, my 18-year-old son was the middle of 3 sons. I want to talk about him, but my other family members don't want to talk as much as I do. What should I do?
That's a really hard one. I think I had.
Did you experience that other
Yeah.
people in the family?
Yes, because we are a blended family, and my stepchildren and James and Stella didn't know each other all that well when we lost James. So it was, they were, how can I say it? We never really had that many close conversations about it. And in the end, I had to accept that if they didn't want to talk about it, then I shouldn't inflict it on them, if you like. So I think I would probably take the easiest route on yourself, actually. It don't let it upset you, and try not to take it too personally, but just accept that they're hurting. They don't know what to say to you. And maybe I think I kind of stepped back and realised that that was how it was. I have to say that the first year, 18 months after James died, and I don't think it's unusual, you're a bit of a social leper because everybody's frightened to talk to you. You know, you have that thing where people cross to the other side of the road rather than speak to you. It's not catching, but people kind of, I don't know. This is one of the areas where I'm constantly saying that to get it out in the open. And a very good book by Annie Broadbent, who became a friend of mine, We Need to Talk About Grief. I think it's been rebadged, rebranded as something else. But it's so important not to have these taboos, and we can enable people who aren't grieving to feel more comfortable with our grief if we put it out there. But within family, it's difficult. I think, you know, I tried. I made sort of encouraging inroads, but never really got very far in the early days.
You mentioned that you've moved house, well, you've moved areas, haven't you? Do you think that moving house helps in any way?
Yeah, we've done 2 moves. So the first move was not very far. It was 8 miles away. And actually, I found it, I think I wrote about this, found it actually quite a relief, because we weren't any longer in the area where James used to go to school. So I wasn't tortured on a daily basis by seeing that school uniform and the places where he worked. But I also found, I can remember one occasion I was in the main street talking to somebody, and I laughed, and somebody I knew came past me and gave me a funny look, as much as to say, how can she be laughing? You know, I know it was maybe 18 months after I'd lost James. She's lost her son. So I kind of felt I was always a bit under scrutiny where we lived. I'd lived there a long time. And so that move was more anxiety inducing, as I think I said in my talk, that I was afraid to leave James behind, but I really didn't. His picture was practically the first thing to go up, you know, the minute we got in the house. And I've never had a problem with feeling he isn't with us. And then we moved from Surrey to Devon, which was the big move. Again, I haven't had a problem with that. And I don't have a problem when I go back to Surrey.
What about James's things?
Oh, James's
possessions. How difficult was that? Like moving his things from his room, and did you take his things with you, and what did you do?
Gosh, it's difficult to remember. Some people will keep a room untouched, and some people want to clear it fairly quickly, and there's no wrong or right with that. James hadn't been in the bedroom he was in very long in the house that we were in, because he'd been at university, and while he was at university, we'd had a bit of a change around of rooms, so he hadn't been there very long, so he hadn't reduced it to a tip. Quite good. And I didn't actually wait all that long before I gradually started putting his things away. It was, for me, it was more painful to see them than not. And when, obviously, by the time we came around to that first move, which would have been, how many years? 10 years? No, 8 years afterwards. I think I was comfortable with what I did. I boxed certain things. Still, some things, even now, I find it hard to look at. His handwriting is that's one that just completely sidelines me. So I've got a box of all his university work, and I really haven't looked at it. I had some of his shirts made into a patchwork bear, you know, one of these memory bears, and that's a rather lovely thing to do. There are various people who do that, so that you've got these kind of tangible reminders of photos. I'm a photographer anyway, so there are photos everywhere. And I hope if you keep all your photographs online, then pay to have some off-site storage as well. so that they're not all on your computer. So if your computer goes bang, you haven't lost all those precious photos and memories. But clearing things is an incredibly personal thing, Carolyn, and I say there's no wrongs or rights to it at all.
Of all the bereaved parents I've met, there's, as Andrea said, some people who clear things very quickly, and other people who leave the room, and there's no wrong or right. I still have things, many precious things from my daughter, and that's 16 years later. I know where they are. I don't look at them very often.
Yes.
I know where they are, and
yeah.
and that's important. So yeah, no wrong or right, I think. There's lots of comments about that in the chat, which is great. Lots of comments, and I'll copy those all to you, Andrea.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any further questions or comments, I'll draw the evening to a close. But before we do, just a huge thank you to Andrea for sharing with us her journey in finding her way of living in the morning light. I hope that in some small measure it's given you some ideas, some tools, well, it obviously has from the chat, to return somehow perhaps to a meaningful or even sometimes joyful maybe life, despite the absence of your child or your sibling. It's been fascinating actually to hear about Andrea's grief toolbox and which elements have helped her as she's continued to live life without James physically here. And again, I really hope that Andrea's perspectives and reflections has resonated with you, and that you found something to take away from her words and build on as you cope with your own heartbreak. Mary Hartley, Compassionate Friends Volunteer Librarian, wrote that Andrea's book, Living in the Morning Light, that's a new one, that's it, specifically focuses on hope, not only of survival, but of a return to a meaningful life, a life which allows you to feel happiness and even joy again. And my hope is that Andrea's talk with you this evening has given you a little piece of that hope to take away with you. I absolutely love this short, I hope Andrea doesn't mind me reading it, short, hopeful poem at the end of her book. And I just wanted to finish by reading it to you. Of course, we could all put our own loved ones' names in it. She writes, James, my James, I say your name with joy, not regret, with pride, not shame, to remember, not forget, with laughter, not tears, with thoughts of today, not yesterday, with love for tomorrow and all our tomorrows. And if you are very newly bereaved, this is probably hard to imagine that you will ever feel like that. But I hope that Andrea's short words there offers a little bit of hope of how it can be in the future. Just a final plug that Andrea's book, Living in the Morning Light,
thank you,
which I would highly recommend, is available from the TCF website. She writes as beautifully as she speaks, actually even more beautifully as her written word. And the proceeds of the sales go towards funding our charity services if you buy it from our website. So please do. Once again, simply a huge thank you to Andrea for taking the time to talk to us tonight and answer your questions and hear your comments. So I just wanted to say that our next event online is our virtual candle lighting, which is part of our annual worldwide candle lighting event, where for 24 years now, in fact, each year candles have been lit in public or quietly at home in private to remember, honour children, siblings and grandchildren who've died far too soon. The event is always on the second Sunday in December at 7 p.m. local time, and it begins in Australia and then makes its way around the world, creating a kind of wave of light. Of course, this year, due to the pandemic, public events will not be able to take place in quite the same way. So we're offering all of you, all bereaved parents, siblings and grandparents, an opportunity to come together again with us on Sunday, the 13th of December in one big virtual event. At the event, we'll have some words spoken, and we'll light our candles together. And the event starts at 6:40, but we aim to gather together from 6:30 on the 13th of December. So we really hope you'll be able to join us, and you can find details of how to register under events, and then go to supportive events. Or I'll put the link actually in the chat before the end of the evening. You need to register to attend, but it's free, the whole event. So finally, a warm and heartfelt thank you for being with Andrea and the Compassionate Friends tonight. As always, I hope for you that in the times to come, you're surrounded by understanding support from both within and outside of the Compassionate Friends. So stay safe and well, and a very good evening to you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And see you again soon, hopefully at the candle lighting, if not before. Okay.
Thanks.
Bye. You can unmute yourself if you want to say goodbye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
Andrea.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.